Welcome back, folks. In this watercolor landscape, we're looking at creating woods and rivers. Now for our background this time, I'm going to use a technique that's called wet on wet. That means I'm getting my paper wet to begin with, and then my paintbrush, of course, is wet, and I am getting watercolor on my paintbrush, and I'm just letting my colors kind of bleed together on that already wet paper, and it creates a lot of different values. If you do have standing water, you can take a paper towel and kind of dab at it and get rid of some of that standing water. This is also a great opportunity to create a few clouds if you feel the need or want to do that. But wet on wet is a great technique when you're working with watercolor. After you let that dry completely, you need to create a horizon line. That, of course, is where the land meets the sky. And I'm going to use a few different greens, and that's going to allow me to create some values. You want to be sure to not cover up the whole box. As you can see, I left some space for what will eventually become my river. After that, I'm going to blot in and just create some values for what will eventually be my tree line. So I'm not only using just pure green, but I'm blending it with some yellows and some blacks. So I'm very blotchy right now. I don't have a lot of details, but I'm focusing on getting some different values in with where my trees and my forest line will be. Notice that I'm varying the heights of my trees to add a little visual interest. Trees grow at different rates, so you want to make sure that you have some varying heights within your forest. I let that dry completely, and I'm adding in some more trees. You'll notice that the ones in front are a little bit darker than the ones behind. That is an easy way to showcase depth. And when I'm doing my trees, it's just a straight line up, and then I'm going kind of zigzags back and forth down. If you want to add some tall ones in the back and add them in a little bit fainter, that's an easy way, again, to establish some space within your drawing and more depth. This would be, of course, in more of the background area. That faint color has a little bit more water to it, so my color is kind of grayed out. So I have green, a little bit of black in there, and a lot of water, because remember, the more water you use, the less vivid your color will end up becoming or being. So I have a lot of different values within my trees, which allow me to have a lot of depth within them, which is great. I'm going to add a few more really dark ones up front, just to showcase that there are a lot of trees, that this is indeed a forest. And the different values within them is what helps me achieve that goal. I'm using a round brush right now. It's a relatively small detail brush. And I have a lot of control over that paintbrush, not allowing too much water on it to encourage my paintbrush and my water to not bleed, because I want to have clean details as I'm working. Remember, trees don't always grow perfectly straight, so if you want to have a couple at an angle, like I'm doing right here, you definitely can. They blow and grow in the wind and are not always perfect. Yeah. Awesome. This is coming together nicely. Love all those different values in the tree line. Moving down to where my grass is, I'm going to try to erase a little bit of this green area here. So I'm just getting that paper wet again, because I want to have water where that green area was. So I want to get some blues in here. Remember, if you ever need to erase values from watercolor, you can just try to wake up your paper again so you get it wet. And as long as you have a clean paintbrush, It's relatively easy to do. And I'm just filling in that white area I left for my river. And where I'm close to the edge of the shoreline or river line, where it's curving, I'm making it a little bit darker because water does have different values within it. So you want to make sure it's not just one solid blue. You're going to have some darker areas and some lighter areas. And make sure you don't have a super wet paintbrush when you're working on this. You want to have control over it. And having those darker areas is going to help establish the illusion that your river is twisting and turning. As you work. I'm going to make a few darker areas within my land as well here, just for some more visual interest. It's a little too similar for my taste at the moment, and I want to create a few different landmarks. I'm also going to end up adding some rocks, so I'm leaving some space for that. But the yellow and the brown and the green are allowing me to plot in maybe some grassy fields or bushes, or at least hinting at the idea of them. Remember, as you're working, having clean lines in certain areas is going to be really important. You don't want everything to bleed together. Having a combination of both when it comes to watercolor is going to make your image much stronger. All right. I'm going to grab a little bit of black on my paintbrush right now, and I'm going to start working at plotting in some rocks, because I want some rocks around my river and on the edges. So right now I'm just starting off with primarily black, but I'm going to need to tame those down because I want to have values within my rocks and not just black spots. Be careful when you do this that your paper is not super wet, because you don't want those black areas to bleed everywhere. And maybe they're not just, your rocks aren't just next to the river. You might have a few in other places within your watercolor. That's really going to be up to you and how you want to design your illustration in your painting. Right now they're not super defined, and that's okay. A lot of things aren't super defined when you're first starting out. But by the time we finish, we want to have a little more definition, and value is going to help us do that. Don't forget the other side of your landscape, of your river. And keep in mind, as you get closer to the foreground and the bottom of your page, your object should be a little bit larger and more detailed. So I'll have to work that through as I progress throughout my watercolor here. Right now my rocks, I'm just getting the shape of them. Maybe there's a couple in the water itself. Since I'm doing that, I'm going to have to create a reflection underneath it, or at least hint at the water flowing around it. But I can do that after I plot them in. Good deal. I want this area to be a little bit darker, so I'm going in with some blue since my black is already on my paper. I'm gonna just make it look like it is indeed curving around, because I want that curve in the river. And since I have that darker value underneath my rocks, or I will, and I have it on my paintbrush right now, I might as well plot it in. I'm also doing this at this time to allow my rocks to dry a little bit more before I start working with them and start incorporating more values. Whew, that river is coming together. Awesome. It is a little bit shiny at the moment. If your paper has a shine to it, that means, of course, that it's not dry yet. Now it's totally dry. I can rework in and get a little more details within my rocks. So at the moment, we're getting some highlights on my rocks because they're not going to be just one solid grayish blackish color. You're going to have light areas and you're going to have darker areas, and it's very important, especially in the foreground, that you have a little bit more detail. I have a very clean paintbrush, not a whole lot of water on it, and I'm getting some of those highlights in. Notice that I'm keeping it relatively similar on the direction or the side where I'm putting my highlighted area, because of course the sun would be hitting it in a similar direction, hitting your rocks in a similar direction. Some of your rocks may be more visible than others, so you want to keep that in mind as you work as well. But having highlights is also going to make the darker areas look darker, which again is going to bring some life to your landscape. Coming along. The ones in the middle ground and further away, I'm not going to do quite as detailed, but you can definitely add in a few highlighted areas. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the ones in the foreground because those are the ones that, of course, should be in better detail since they are indeed closer to me or closer to you. Don't forget the other side of the river. And if you end up getting too much of a highlighted spot on your watercolor, you can always go back in with a darker value and add to it. No problem at all. Notice that I'm cleaning my paintbrush almost every time in between, because I'm taking away values. And then I'm going to just go in and make it a little bit darker in those few areas. Once your paper dries, it shows you what you may need to get a little bit darker, which is why watercolor is good to build step by step. And you can see your progression as you're working and what you may need to improve upon. I'm going to snag in a little bit of white for a couple of highlighted areas, not just taking away the black, but also adding in a little bit of white. With white, oftentimes less is more, just got to be careful with it when you're working with watercolor. Awesome! We are getting real close to being done here. I hope your woods and river landscape went well.